Hello. Joining us in a few minutes is Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz from Columbia University in New York. Now, he's a recognised world expert on globalisation and free trade agreements, like the one that our government is determined to ratify, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's the author of many best-selling books, like The Price of Inequality and The Great Divide. And hopefully, he joins us now. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for agreeing to take part in our program.
Nice to be here.
The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, wonderful name, that our government is about to sign. Like so many trade deals since the 1990s onwards, it's no longer about trading physical commodities like beef and cars or kiwi fruit. Modern trade agreements contain chapters about investment and finance and e-commerce and intellectual property, which benefit large corporations and financial elites. What do the big companies and the financial elites actually want from these international deals?
Well, you might say, to put it in a very simple way, they want profits. They want to make money. The question is, what are some of the ways in which these expansions increase their profits? And sometimes, if you're selling risky derivatives, if you're Goldman Sachs or one of the big financial giants, you want more people to buy your risky products. Forget about what it does to the country. You want to sell. So they fought against regulations in the United States that would hamper their ability to make profits, and they're fighting against regulations in other countries that are important for maintaining financial stability, because for them, all they care about is their profits. You know, the fact that we had a global financial crisis in 2008 was collateral damage. So what if taxpayers had to pay $1 trillion or so? They made more money, and that's what they were focused on. But there's a more invidious aspect of the investment agreements and of the intellectual property provisions. The investment agreements have, in addition, two other objectives. They have an objective to make sure that governments don't regulate. If you're a natural resource company, you don't like environmental regulations. And if they discover that you are polluting, they don't want you to pass a regulation to say you can't pollute. So the investment agreements try to tie the hands of governments to stop them from making regulations. But there's another thing that they do. Because with these investment agreements, American firms or firms in other advanced countries have more property rights investing abroad than they do at home. It means that when they go to their workers and say, if you don't take a wage cut or if you don't moderate your wage demands, we're going abroad because we have better property rights abroad than we have at home. We get cheaper labor, and once we produce the goods, we can bring them back to the United States. It makes it very credible. And I think it's contributed to the wage stagnation that has occurred in the United States and other advanced countries. Intellectual property is not about really intellectual property. It's really about denying access to generic medicines for the very poor. Big Pharma wants to undermine that. They can't do it in Congress because Congress would say that's outrageous. They can't have a transparent and open debate. So what they try to do is bury it in a trade agreement to make it more difficult for generic drugs to be brought to market and therefore raising prices. That was a provision that was, you might say, corrected to at least some extent in the when you went from the TPP to your comprehensive and progressive trade agreement.
Well, just to summarize some of that so that I understand it, is it fair to say that the financial and investment and intellectual property chapters are actually about trying to get money to flow over borders without any trouble, so that they can make as much profit as possible out of it? And also, do I understand you properly to say that these agreements have had a downward pressure on wages in developed countries like New Zealand?
That's right. And they've had an upward pressure on drug prices. So they squeeze consumers in a third way. So there are, as ordinary citizens, you are hurt lower wages. You are hurt by worse environmental regulations, less good economic regulations, and higher prices of the drugs you buy.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the arguments that we hear regularly from politicians who support agreements like the CPTPP is that if our exporters make a lot of profit, then, to quote our Trade Minister, that will improve the standard of living for all New Zealanders, and it will create more jobs. I wonder what you think about the validity of that argument. It seems to me a version of the discredited trickle-down theory.
It is a version of the discredited trickle-down theory. Let me talk a little bit about TPP and what even the U.S. government said after they're required to do an analytic study. Their conclusion was, when that's fully implemented in about 15 years, the net effect on U.S. GDP was 0.15 of 1%. And I would say more objective analysts, like at Tufts University, said that was a gross exaggeration. So basically, no effect on growth, but it had these adverse effects that I described, distributive effects. So I would be very skeptical about these claims. The evidence is that, in fact, when you have agreements between advanced countries and poorer countries, in general, the goods that the advanced countries export are capital intensive, and the goods they import are labor intensive. And so if trade is roughly balanced, which it has to be in the long run, that means that in the advanced countries, the demand for labor goes down. They're basically job killing. Now, if you have a well-functioning macro policy, you can stimulate the economy and you can undo the adverse effect of trade. But since 2008, we have not had a well-functioning macroeconomy. Unemployment has been very high, and even today, labor force participation is very low in the United States. So there are, the number of people who've been able to get a job is low. Our unemployment rate is at last relatively low, but that's because a lot of people have given up looking for jobs.
The CPTPP agreement contains investor-state disputes provisions which would allow foreign investors from at least 4 of the 11 countries, and they're the larger ones like Canada and Japan and Mexico, to sue our government in overseas tribunals if we passed laws which the investor believed reduced their profits. The advocates of the deal say that the risk is minimal. The opponents say that ISDS provisions are unfair and they give foreign investors greater rights than domestic investors, and that we have a robust legal system that foreign investors could seek redress in our courts, and that for a country to defend itself against giant corporates is very expensive. And so the worry is that future New Zealand governments may feel that it's easier to give in on some, say, proposed labour or environmental laws than to pass them. Are there issues of democracy and nationhood here that we should be concerned about?
Very much. There are also issues of justice. Why should foreign investors be treated better than domestic investors? As you said, New Zealand has a good judicial system. If there's a problem with the judicial system, reform it for everybody, foreign and domestic investors. So there's absolutely no justification for these tribunals. At the most, they should be used as a last resort. After you've gone through the domestic, you say, well, there's been prejudice by domestic judges. I don't believe that's going to be true. But if that were a case, you might want to say, okay, there's a final appellate process after you've exhausted domestic remedy. The notion that there's nothing to fear is wrong. Canada has lost something like 19 cases in these private ISDS suits. The conception of the suits, what you can sue for, what the compensation is totally wrong. You can be compensated not just for your lost investment, but for any anticipated profits that you might have. You can sue even when there's a good domestic rationale for having a regulation. For instance, Philip Morris sued Uruguay when it passed a regulation not forbidding smoking cigarettes, but saying you have to disclose that there are health risks. The disclosure was intended to discourage people from smoking, and it worked. That was a great thing. But Philip Morris lost profits. And on the basis of that, they sued. The panel split 2-1, fortunately for Uruguay. But you could imagine it switching the other way. And the cost, as you say, were so large that Uruguay couldn't afford them. Fortunately, the mayor of New York, Mayor Bloomberg, and other wealthy Americans paid Uruguay's costs. But it's unconscionable that a country would subject itself to these extraordinarily suits. Again, they should be framed, if you have them, very narrowly. It's about discrimination. It's about treating foreigners different from nationals. There was no issue of discrimination in the cases I've described. In the case of Uruguay, a domestic cigarette company would have been subject to the same regulation. So they should have been construed narrowly to be about discrimination. The first placement should be through domestic provisions. If there's something wrong with the domestic courts, that should be fixed for everybody. And at most, for a final appeal, you could imagine a permanent appellate court.
One of the arguments given for why New Zealand should accept agreements like the current one basically runs that we can't afford to be left out of such large trade deals, because other countries like Australia, for example, would sign up and they'd get the competitive advantage over us. So we better be prepared, as one previous trade minister put it, to swallow a dead rat or two. Now, the e-commerce chapter of the CPTPP might be one of those dead rats, because it contains provisions which, as I understand them, would give giant corporations such as the Googles, the Amazons and the Ubers of this world the right to profit from doing business in our economy, but not have offices here or to pay taxes here, and also be able to gather personal data about us and host them in servers overseas in a jurisdiction that would make it very difficult for anyone who had concerns about what they were doing to look into their business practices. Are we going to see more of this take it or leave it approach from the larger countries to these huge trade deals? And if so, what kind of strategies could countries like New Zealand adopt to stop having to accept provisions which are clearly going to benefit multinational enterprises, but not our country?
You're absolutely right that these are intended to benefit the United States and other big countries, and not New Zealand. And I would say quite the contrary, that keeping a you might say, an ecosystem within New Zealand for New Zealand companies to flourish would probably be even better for your economy. Even in the United States, there is a worry about how these big companies are swallowing up all our little companies, undermining competition, not allowing them to flourish. Even our VC companies are now worrying about this, about how we've lost the balance of power. But the big companies have the balance of power with the U.S. trade representative, and that's true in other countries. The ministers of trade pay attention to the big companies, not to the little guys. So I would say that if I wanted to make sure that on the one hand there was a space for the development of New Zealand companies, and on the other hand I wanted to protect basic values in New Zealand about privacy, about whatever you want to focus on, I think this is what you call a dead rat that is not going to be benefiting you. You're going to throw up.
But you get the point, don't you, that our politicians feel powerless about this. I mean, the e-commerce chapter has barely been mentioned, and yet it seems to me one of those things that the digital economy that we're entering into is going to give huge power to the existing digital companies. How do you start a competitor to Google? What can we do?
Well, it's interesting. This lack of balance was one of the reasons that one of the founders of BlackBerry, which was began as a small Canadian company, very innovative, opposed TPP. He said it was designed, the intellectual property provisions were designed to advantage big corporations at the expense of small startups and small companies. And I think that's the kind of detail that you need to look at. And if you're a small country like New Zealand, where you don't have the Googles and the Facebooks, you ought to give a second thought to letting the big companies in America drive your economy. Look at Europe has been fighting Google and the other big companies. Europe is an economy with 350 million people, and they're having a hard time. They're resenting what they are doing to their economy. That should be a warning. And you ask, do you have the clout that the European Commission has? And I think you know the answer to that. And that should be, I think, something you need to bear in mind.
The trade agreement that New Zealand's about to ratify, the second word in that agreement title, after comprehensive, is progressive. What would a truly progressive agreement look like? Could they expand these agreements to include provisions like climate change, for example? What would a fair agreement look like?
Well, I think you've hinted at how a 21st century progressive agreement might be markedly different from earlier agreements. Climate change is one of the big issues of the 21st century. We have to deal with it. Interestingly, in the United States, when we were trying to get what was called fast track, a detail of how we get our trade agreements through, there was an effort by many Democrats to say you have to have something about climate change. And you particularly have to be sure that there's nothing in the agreement that will restrict the ability to pass climate change regulations. But the investment agreement in TPP was bad for the environment. So it was not progressive. I haven't had a chance to study whether there have been the changes that dealt with that, but I would be surprised if they really put climate change at the center of the agreement in the way that they should. Another important aspect, inequality is one of our big issues today. And a progressive agreement would be an agreement that recognizes that there are going to be groups of individuals, perhaps large groups, maybe a majority of citizens, who will actually see their incomes decline. And it should be a commitment of the group and each country within the group to make sure that that doesn't happen. So in the agreement, they should say there is a commitment that makes sure that there are no major losers. And that should be one of the things that if you don't fulfill that, just like you can go to court to enforce the investment provisions for the corporations, workers should be able to go to court and say, you have not fulfilled the obligations under the agreement. If corporations spoil the environment, which they have done many, many places, individuals should have the right and say, this corporation is destroying our environment. It's taken our profits. It's taken our resources. It talks about rights, but there are no responsibilities. And so we have to marry rights and responsibilities. So that would be what a progressive, these are elements of what would be a progressive agreement. And finally, a progressive agreement would put access to health at the center. Now, you've done a better job, I have to say, than TPP did. That was one of the areas where you made progress. But I was so upset with the way that President Obama, who had made Obamacare, health care for all Americans, a singular achievement of his administration, when it came to trade, was willing to sacrifice access to medicine, generic medicines, for Americans. And it shows you the influence of big money and big pharma, big corporations in these trade agreements.
Just thinking about your book, The Price of Inequality, how many years ago was that now?
2015, but it was, 2012. 2012, well before the issue had reached the prominence which it has today. I wish people had paid more attention to it then.
Because I was going to ask you, is the price higher now?
Yes, it is. Things have gotten worse. Things have gotten much worse. And the consequences have been felt. I talked about the price of inequality, what it would do to our economy, to our society, and to our politics. And in many ways, what we are seeing with the election of Trump is the realization of the disaffection, the despair that so many Americans feel as a result of the way we have left such a large fraction of Americans behind.
Isn't it extraordinary how it's playing out? I just want to go to a couple of questions now that have more to do with politics than economics. To what extent are modern free trade agreements about geopolitical control? I'm thinking here of President Obama's last State of the Nation address, in which he said, with TPP, China doesn't get to set the rules in the region, we do. So I'm trying to work out who is actually trying to rule the world.
I think that was a misguided thrashing around of the American president as he began to realize that America's power in the world was diminishing and didn't like it. No one under your watch wants to admit, we are smaller than we were. It diminished with the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan. It diminished with the global financial crisis. It diminished as inequality increased and America was seen no longer as the land of opportunity. All of these contributed to it. But it also diminished just by history. China and India are growing much, much faster than the United States. Anybody who believes in democracy has to say their voice has to count more. And what would we feel if China said, who is going to determine trade rules in America? Should it be Europe or the United States? We would take great offense if Europe said they were going to write the rules for America. Asia, I can tell you, did take great offense with Obama's speech. It was inopportune.
Thank you. President Trump, of course, actually pulled out of the TPP. What's your reading about that? Are we actually going to see a return to protectionism and nationalism in the world? Or is Trump just an aberration?
Trump is an aberration, I hope. He's an aberration in so many ways, from normality, from decency, from what we think of as rational discourse. But the resentment towards globalization is deep felt. And it likely would have occurred under some other president, maybe later, maybe without the real, the kind of hard edge that Trump brings to the table. But it won't go away when Trump goes away.
Is that because the huge financial corporations and financial elites won't go away?
They'll still want their agenda, which is more profits in their pocket, which includes lower wages for workers. Workers, of course, are not going to be happy with that particular agenda. And if it is the case that globalization makes the pie bigger, then in principle, everybody could be made better off. And the corporations, if they were a little less greedy, could have supported legislation to make sure that there are active labor market policies, industrial policies, to redistribution policies, protection policies, to make sure that everybody does well. To a large extent, Scandinavia has managed to do that. They recognized they were democracies, small economies had to be open, but as democracies, a majority of people, a vast majority, had to be winners and had to feel like they were winners. And that's why they created a welfare state. That's why they created all these policies. And that's why today in many of the Scandinavian countries, there's much less fear of globalization than there is in America. And so I think the real problem here is not so much globalization, but the way we've managed it and the way globally, the rules of the game have been set by greedy corporations of the North at the expense of the South and at the expense of small businesses and ordinary workers. And the way we've mismanaged globalization within our countries, where we haven't done what we should have done to make sure that the fruits of globalization were equitably shared.
I think New Zealand's an interesting case, really, because we were a socialist country, and we did a lot of the things that the Scandinavians did. We still have a good health system. We have free schools, that sort of thing. The trouble is, in 1984, the Labour government introduced neoliberal economics, and they did it in a very radical and very fast way. And one of the things they did was they got rid of tariffs. And so the problem is now that when we come to the trading table, it's a bit like coming to a poker table without any chips. We haven't really got any tariffs to trade. And so we end up having to agree to other things that we would really rather not agree to. If you were engaged by the New Zealand government to advise them on treaties like the one we're about to enter, given our situation that we can't lower tariffs, but we want to be part of the deal, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to talk to the other countries to try to understand better how one can get a truly progressive trade agreement. Because the issues that you've talked about for New Zealand those issues arise in many of the other countries. In some of the other countries, Malaysia, they have some very effective state enterprises, and TPP was trying to shut those down under American ideology, didn't like the competition from these state enterprises, even though they were not subsidized. So I think if you had managed it carefully, you would have realized that in each of the countries, there were concerns about TPP. I had talked during the TPP negotiations to all the health negotiators and made a big plea to, do something to preserve access to generic medicines. And I was very pleased that when the United States dropped out, they did get together and they said, what the United States was doing was wrong. And they agreed together to change. I think now that the United States is out of the picture, there needed to have been, a longer period of negotiation where you could say, this agreement was really shaped by the United States big businesses for American big businesses. Now that they're out of the scene, let's try to do an agreement that is fair for the other 11 countries.
I'm going to close now, but I do want to mention one thing to you. I was curious that after the TPP fell over, Japan picked up the deal and suddenly wanted to lead the 11 into a new deal. And I wondered about that, and when I looked into it, I could see that the top corporations in the world, most of them are in America. The majority of them are in America. But the next country that has the next amount, about 50% of what's in the USA, is Japan. And so I'm wondering whether we're talking less about countries and their interests in these deals, or we're talking more about large corporations wanting to push their agenda, and it doesn't matter what country they're in. What do you think?
That's an interesting speculation. Let me say this about say Big Pharma, which is one of the big players in the American negotiations. Their interest is not America. They don't pay taxes. They're one of the best tax avoiders. Google and Apple are also notorious tax avoiders. So they don't contribute to the fisc, the public finances. They don't contribute much to jobs. They do a lot of their production in Singapore or some other country. What are we getting out of it? And what the answer of that is campaign contributions, lobbying. And so Big Pharma is not about helping the United States. It's about helping Big Pharma. And if you look at it that way, I think you maybe get some insight into the way trade negotiations have been conducted.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Yep, thank you. Good.
This program was made possible through the donations of over 300 friends of New Zealand Public Television. Thank you.